Right, so sitting down with me today is someone who's played an integral part in my own transplant journey. He's the medical director of the heart transplant unit at St Vincent's Hospital, co-head of the Victor Chang Transplantation Research Laboratory, and conjoint professor of medicine at the University of New South Wales. Professor Peter McDonald, thanks for joining us. Pete, it's believe it or not, it's 15 years ago when you sat me down and told me I actually needed to have a heart transplant.
Is it that long ago?
The time has gone. It's certainly gone a lot quicker than the few years prior to the transplant for me. And I know you've achieved quite a bit in that time as well.
It's certainly been an interesting time, yeah.
Yeah, so I thought we might start by just asking what led you to study medicine in the first place, and then in particular, get into specialising in transplantation.
Yeah, look, I don't come from a medical family. I'm the first person and possibly the last in my family to go into medicine. So I've always, I guess, wanted to help people in one form or another. And when I completed my HSC, I did that in Melbourne. I got the marks to get into medicine, and it just seemed to be the logical next step. And but having got into medicine, I've sort of really loved it. And when I started my clinical training, there was a certain fascination with the heart, in that you could learn a lot, not just by talking to the patient, or listening to the patient, but by listening to the heart directly with the stethoscope. And there was a certain fascination with that. And also, when I started my cardiology training, it was in an era when lots of new treatments and very effective treatments were emerging for patients with heart disease, not just in terms of medication, but also procedures. And that's really continued all throughout my career. It's really been an amazing journey. When I look back to the 1970s, when I started my medical course, to what it's like now, it's just unrecognizably different. And I remember as a medical student seeing young men in their 40s and 50s being admitted to the coronary care, having suffered a massive heart attack, and watching them fade away and die over a couple of days, just in the absence of any effective treatment for them. Nowadays, fortunately, that's the exception rather than the rule. But when I finished my medical training, I then went into cardiology and really enjoyed that. And when I finished that, I was about to take on a position overseas, but I got tapped on the shoulder by the head of medicine, who said, look, I needed to go to the laboratory and spend 3 years working in the laboratory on a sort of basic science project, doing a PhD, which I did from 85 through to the end of 87. And then having completed that, that gave me, I sort of went into that with quite a bit of trepidation, because I thought, well, I'll be leaving clinical medicine and I'll lose my skills and all this. But fortunately, that didn't happen. And it gave me a completely different sort of skill set and way of looking at information that I wouldn't have got otherwise. And having completed that, I went back to a clinical job in Melbourne. And at that stage, the heart transplant program had started up at St Vincent's. That was the only one in Australia at the time. And the surgeon at the hospital I worked at tapped me on the shoulder, another tap on the shoulder, and said, we're looking for a bright young cardiologist to look after our heart transplant patients once we operate on them. And they saw me as potentially filling that role. So I came to St Vincent's for the first time in 1988, just to get a feel for it. I spent a week here in the transplant program. And during that week, there was a donor referral, an interstate donor referral It was in, I think that it was in Adelaide, and Victor Chang, who was the head of the transplant program at the time, suggested I go on the donor retrieval just to see what it's like. So I remember getting in this police car outside the front of the hospital, driving down to the airport with sirens blasting and all the lights being synchronized. And we got there in 7 minutes from the hospital. And then we got piled into a Learjet, which happened to belong to Kerry Packer, who lent us the jet to do these retrievals when he didn't need it. So then we flew to Adelaide, went to the donor hospital, and then was confronted with, the actual donor, which is sort of has a very sobering effect on you. And when you realise that someone who was previously in good health has suddenly died, and but died in circumstances where they can donate their organs. And then, the organ was retrieved, back in the plane, flying back into Sydney, and then back to the operating theatre. And nothing in my previous medical career had prepared me for anything like this. But yeah, I was sort of bitten by the bug, so to speak, and I decided then to come back to St Vincent's to do a year's fellowship in transplant medicine, again with a view to going back to Melbourne. So I came with my wife and my young son at that stage, and we spent a year here, and about a month before we were due to go back to Melbourne to take up a position in the transplant unit there, which had actually gone to another hospital in Melbourne, not the one I came from. Victor and Phil Spratt, who were the two major surgeons involved in the program at the time, said, look, we want you to stay. And we decided, my wife and I decided to stay. And the rest, as they say, is history. So that was back in 1989. So I've been with the program for 32 years now. And as I was saying earlier, it's been an amazing journey. It's during that time there's been some spectacular highs and some spectacular lows as well, as you can imagine.
Yeah, no, I'm certainly glad you didn't go back down to Melbourne, Pete. As I said, you've been a huge part of everything I've been through, and I know whenever I'm in hospital, I certainly hope that you're rostered on that day.